Okay, should be good to go. So welcome everyone to the second installment in our Appalachian Natural History seminar series this semester. We're really excited to have Emma Kiser joining us today. Emma is a graduate student, PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Kentucky. And her work involves environmental history. So we're really excited to get to hear from her today. And Emma, whenever you are ready, go ahead and take it away.
All right, I'm just gonna try to get this. Going. All right, well, thanks so much for inviting me. I really wish that I was taking this class. Everything that you're reading, all the guests that you have invited, I know I would learn so much from you all. As a historian, I have my perspective is more human or centric, and so I would really appreciate hearing from you all about natural history. So what I'm going to do is briefly talk about the three fields of inquiry that I situate my research into. There are Appalachian studies, environmental history, and oral history. And after I kind of talk about each of those, then we'll listen to some oral history clips. And I'd love to hear, would love to hear from you all along the way. If you have any questions or comments, please ask. So we're going to start off by listening to some forest sounds. This is a sound recording in Blanton Forest. Blanton Forest is in Harlan County in eastern Kentucky. It's the largest old growth forest in Kentucky, and it's very rare as an old growth forest. And I'm curious what you hear. So please, if you want to tell me after we listen to this what kind of sounds you hear, that would be great. So anything you want to share about what you heard or felt or didn't hear, and you can do that through the audio or the chat.
I'm so sorry, that audio didn't come through super well. Could you just try it one more time?
Okay, sure. And maybe that it's forest sound. So I'll try again. Oops.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I think it's blocking out background noise. Could we try one more time?
Should I make sure the sound is, let's see. Maybe if I stop sharing and then try it again.
Try one more time, and it might be on my end, it might be on your end, but
okay.
Oh, Dr. Arthur can hear it fine, so it might be on my end.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I heard it the first two times. I didn't hear it this last time. So
okay.
I came across fine for me.
Could you hear that? Kenton.
So some dripping water or moving water.
Yeah. And then a few comments I just saw in the chat. The stream sounds so peaceful. Definitely no airplanes overhead, birds, maybe water dripping. Yeah, these are, I also felt like, oh, good, there's no mechanical sound. It feels so peaceful. So so it worked on y'all's in that time.
Yeah, we were able to hear the first part of it.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I guess we'll hopefully the other clips will work. Just let me know. So while we're here together, I'd appreciate it if us thinking about how Appalachian environmental history is different from or similar to Appalachian natural history. As I mentioned, like history is human-centered, and natural history is more of a scientific perspective. And so my questions that if we could consider how can these two fields work more closely together to better serve the Appalachian region, we can return to those questions toward the end. So if we could take a few minutes, I'd love to hear from you all what natural history means to you. And if you could just take a moment and jot down how you would define it. If you were telling your friend or neighbor, how would you define natural history? And then we can all share in about, we'll just take about 30 seconds or so. All right, it's been almost 30 seconds. Would anybody want to share how they define natural history?
Yeah, Josh.
I wrote that natural history is the story of how the earth became what it is today.
So the story of how the earth came to be the way that it is today, mostly without human interaction. Others? History of the natural environment in a region.
Cool. Yeah, great. Any
Anyone
others?
else? One more. I saw everyone writing. Hayden, what did you put?
I said scientific and socio-ecological accounts of how the natural world has and will continue to develop.
Scientific and sociological accounts of how the world has and will continue to develop.
So there's people and culture involved in that. Cool, great. Thank y'all so much for sharing. And then there are a few on chat. Understanding species, their life histories, knowing what plants and other species are on the landscape and how they interact. Defining it as the history of mostly biological influences on abiotic factors, increase and decline in species affected and affecting climate. Awesome, these are really helpful. Great responses. So now let's think about what is environmental history. So how would you alter, if I know we all have various experience with environmental history, some of us may not be familiar with it at all. And so how would you change your definition at all? Would you add anything to it? How would your definition be similar or change or be different. Any thoughts on environmental history? Would it still be a story of how the Earth came to be today? Would it have a scientific perspective, sociological perspective, climate, species focused?
So Karen says how humans have interacted with the world around them.
Cool, yeah.
Others?
I like the relationship between all the different aspects of this environment along with human interaction.
So ecological interactions plus human interactions.
Awesome. Yeah, those are really good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about like how I have come to know environmental history. It's hard to define. So my understanding of environmental history is seeking to understand how humans have shaped environments and how environments have shaped human lives. Much like how you've said, it's an innovative, fast-growing field. It emerged in the 60s and 70s with the social movements of the New Left, the civil rights movement, women's movement, anti-war student protests, and environmentalism all happening during this time. And so there was a call to push history beyond stories about great men or great wars. And so if I were to, some of ways that people are now defining environmental history, because it's also changed over time, the field itself, is that it pays attention to ideas, scientific ideas, aspirational myths, concepts that help us to catch the natural world within words and images in human heads. It's a history of power, social, economic, and political forces that have tried to command nature, sustain it, shape it. It's playing with scales. You can have an environmental history of a local place, or even maybe your body or microbe, and but it can also range from local to regional to national to global, and we've seen environmental histories all across those scales. And it's about being precise about place and linkages beyond place, and that is being ecologically precise. It's also a moral project. It has activist roots like other fields of history that emerged in the 60s, such as history, like African American history, gender history. So it's intentionally a moral project, and it takes materiality seriously. So it's not just about ideas about environment or nature, the natural world. It's also soil and water and animals and plants and microbes have active roles in making history. And so there are lots of different methods, because environment is such an umbrella term. There are lots of ways of doing environmental history. So some methods include the traditional archive history, or the types of things, documents that you can find in archives like land deeds, newspaper articles, diaries, and looking for environment or the natural world in them. Looking for modes of production, the built environment, it goes on and on. Of course, scientific source material is the source and a way of interpreting history, analyzing environmental policies and laws and how local residents have responded to or resisted or shaped those policies and laws. Photographs, oral history, music such as the blues. There's a historian who looked at blues lyrics for understanding how African Americans experienced the Mississippi flood of 1927. And then various frameworks and theories. Historians aren't always theoretically inclined, but they can definitely use theories to help interpret the past. And then today I saw that there was a webinar about how historical methods can look at environmental baselines as reference points for understanding how for conservation and policy efforts, and what are the best practices that stand to impact species survival, climate change resiliency, and the integrity of ecosystems. That's very exciting and innovative and important. So then when we look at Appalachian environmental history, we're looking at doing environmental history in or about the Appalachian region and the intersection of Appalachian studies and environmental history. And Dr. Ben talked about Appalachian studies on Wednesday. And as a field that emerged by around the 1970s to critically examine land ownership and taxation and persistent poverty, myths of Appalachia as backwards and isolated or violent, which originated as America was industrializing. And so it's really important that environmental histories are engaged in Appalachian studies works. So here are a few examples of Appalachian environmental histories. There are histories about displacement, violence, deforestation, mountaintop removal, strip mining, racism. There are also histories about commons and community and resistance. There are forest histories, like the creation of the Great Smoky Mountains and Mount Mitchell. And so there are even environmental histories about forest resources like ginseng and the American chestnut. So it's a rich field, Appalachian environmental history is, but it doesn't get the recognition it deserves in the broader environmental history field. So my third field of inquiry is oral history. Oral history is a field of study, a method of gathering, preserving, and interpreting the voices and memories of people, communities, and participants in past events. It is the oldest type of historical inquiry. It predates the written word, and it is also one of the most modern. It was initiated again with tape recorders in the 1940s, and anyone can do an oral history interview on their phone, and it's incredibly accessible. There are lots of practitioners. As a historian, oral history helps me to fill in the gaps of what you find in the archives or what's documented. A good quote here is that oral history helps round out the story of the past. It gives us an understanding of an individual level of experience, how someone experienced a past event, what they thought, how they felt, how they remember it. It also gives an oral history becomes a sound portrait of who we are in the present and what we remember about the past. It's traditionally between an interviewer and an interviewee or a narrator, and the interviewer asks questions and the narrator tells the story about the past. Oh yeah, and I was going to say that University of Kentucky has a really great oral history center. If you haven't checked it out, you should, and it's really user friendly. It's a lot of the interviews are available digitally, and you can search by keywords and go to that specific point in the interview and listen to it. And that's really helped with making oral histories more accessible once they're recorded and in the archives. So there's also growing recognition of the intersection and the compatibility of oral history and environmental history. Doing oral histories about the environment helps with building archives about environmental change, ecological change, environmental justice issues, and it's finally kind of getting more recognition for being an important methodology for environmental history. One book that is pretty central to my work is The Land Speaks: New Voices at the Intersection of Oral and Environmental History. And it the co-editors, Debbie Lee and Catherine Newfont. Catherine Newfont is a professor at UK, my advisor, and they argue that The Land Speaks, that they're that it's sending out messages, that you hear thunder, that means that's a signal, a message, grab your umbrella before you go outside, or and then there are various levels of fluency with that language. They call it land fluent narrators who can interpret messages, and so finding a narrator in an oral history interview or for an oral history project, that someone who is fluent in this place, who can tell you about its history, is really important. And so I'm going to, delve into more of my research. When I've been able to interview a few land fluent narrators, and my research is about old growth forests, in particular Blanton Forest in eastern Kentucky, which I mentioned before. And it was identified. Has anyone been to Blanton Forest, by the way?
We have one student who's been to Blanton Forest.
Cool. Yeah, okay, good. Yeah, I highly recommend going. It was just identified by an ecologist, Mark Evans, in the early 1990s, when he was conducting natural areas inventories of Kentucky, looking for places that have not been highly disturbed by humans and or developed or converted into agriculture, or lots of different ways of disturbance. But he was in a helicopter, and he saw what he thought was about 2,000 acres of old growth forest along Pine Mountain, which stretches through southeastern Kentucky. And so he was very excited and surprised. And when he went to ground truth it, so he went and determined whether it was indeed logged or not. And he found that it was an old growth forest. And so there was a campaign to raise money for the state to purchase it as a state nature preserve. And so that happened, and it was became protected by the mid 1990s. And so this is a clip, and I hope y'all can hear it. It's him talking about when he was exploring Blanton Forest. He's in this rhododendron thicket, and he has an encounter with a wild animal. And this is before it's been protected as a state nature preserve.
In a rhodo thicket, like the air is very still and heavy and dense and humid in there. I mean, literally, you're just sweating out everything, crawling through. And so you're always a little paranoid because, I mean, I love, like I said, all of God's creatures, but if you come face to face with like a rattlesnake, it's a little intimidating, or a copperhead. So you're always looking out, and then because you're at eye level, then you're on your belly doing a belly crawl and looking for hornets and anything else that might, not like me. And so I'm working my way through this thicket. I could hardly see. It was so hot. I remember the heat. And all of a sudden, I look up, and like an apparition in front of me, not like 40, 50 feet away, 20 meters maybe, is this large mammal. And at first I thought it was a wolf. It was big. It was a coyote, a very huge, healthy female coyote that was not happy to see me. Her ears were back, her hackles were up, and she was growling at me. Deep growl. And she was, like I said, maybe it's because I was so low, but she looked like a big wolf, really big. And there was nothing I could do. I could not extricate myself quickly from this situation. I couldn't even stand up. One of the things, if you see a bear or other wild animals that might be able to harm you, you want to make yourself big as possible. You put your hands over your head like this, and you yell at them because you want to be intimidating to them. I got another bear story I could tell you on that. It didn't work. But here I couldn't make myself big, and I couldn't get out fast. I was in trouble. And then I realized I was even in more trouble, because behind her was a big tree that was down. She had 3 pups. And there's nothing more dangerous than a mother animal. She will do anything to defend her kids, and she'll kill you without a second thought. And she's growling at me. Her pups are sitting there looking, what's mom getting all upset about? And it's me, So what did I do? I became the coyote whisperer. I didn't know the term at the time, but I was frightened, and I did the really only thing that came to my mind as I started speaking to the little coyote in a very soft, what I was trying to make the most non-threatening kind of voice, And I don't even remember exactly what I said. I just wanted to calm her down. I told her I wasn't going to hurt her. I told her I was there, in fact, to help her. I wanted to protect this forest, that she lived in. And whatever, all of a sudden, man, her hackles went down. Eventually, her ears came back up. A little rumble in her throat, just softer and softer. I talked my way out of it. You can tell I'm a talker sometimes. I can blah, 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 especially about stuff I like. Well, I think I either bored her to tears talking so much, she finally said, this guy's no threat, whatever, and walked away. Or somehow she picked up my vibes, which is what I hope, that's, if I'm telling the stories, she picked up my good vibes, that I wanted to help her and save the mountain. And so eventually she turned around, she walked back to her kids, her cubs, and she turned around, and they just looked at me. And so I just backed up. It's very hard to back up gracefully when you're on a belly crawl or do anything gracefully. But I worked my way backward, out. And it wasn't until I got far enough away where I felt like I was past the danger zone where I realized I was freaking frightened. I was really frightened.
I hope y'all heard that. Okay, good. All right, so he is a really good storyteller, but I also was struck by how he told that story about listening, talking with, and having this moment of communication with this mother coyote. But I was also, so it's a good story and it makes you feel like you're there beside him, exploring Blanton Forest. But I was wondering if anybody has any thoughts about and could share how do you see value or use of oral history as like a supplement to other scholarship about forests? If anyone has any thoughts on that. And we can always return back to that question later.
I mean, I think it's just really humanizing, which can be hard to get in a field where you're talking about a variety of biological factors that you can't necessarily communicate with. So a really good oral history like that can connect someone to the topic and, I mean, really invest them in it.
Yeah, I agree. Thanks. And that makes sense. That also, the investment of, wanting to also protect this old growth forest from threats. Like if there, I can see why that also would be helpful, and it would be encouraging to hear that. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to share anything?
Hayden, one of the students has something to say too. I'll mute while he's sharing, and then I'll.
I'm sorry, I might have missed something.
So, sorry, I was just muting while Hayden shared so that I wouldn't be
Okay.
weirdly muffled. Yeah, so he was just saying that the kinds of things that you might hear in an oral history would be different from maybe what a scientist might encounter or experience in their own experience with the natural world. Is that?
Gotcha. Yeah. So you also learn about other things that you may that journal may not mention, which it has value too. Thank you. Okay, so here we have I did a walking interview with Kyle Napier. He is he's actually from Letcher County, close to Harlan County, and he grew up playing on Pine Mountain and in different area. So he hadn't been through Blanton Forest before he became an ecologist, but he has been he's been working for the state as a biologist, ecologist who monitors Blanton Forest. So he monitors the health of the forest. And so we did a walking interview where he talked about what he does and also some of the history, because he pretty much compiled the forest protection plan for Blanton Forest, and he spoke to a lot of people and did he did his ground truthing of Blanton Forest. But so I asked him, I knew that there had been some home sites along Watts Creek, and I asked him about that. And then I asked him about old growth forests, and I knew that they were rare. I knew that old growth and I saw that y'all are going to be talking about old growth forests a little bit later in the semester. But my understanding of them was that there's various ages. Dead trees are left there. There's some that are dead that are standing, some that have fallen, and they create these habitats. So they bring in a lot of biodiversity, but I still had to ask him to explain a little bit more about the meaning of it. So I'm gonna play first a clip about the home sites and then a clip about the how he talks about old growth forests. And that's where people settled along Watts Creek.
Yeah, there were several different homesteads here in Blanton Forest. Some of them are in places that you wouldn't think that they would ever be, but because they're so far from anything, and probably the only way they got to and from those places was by horseback. But there's some very far up in the forest, you know, just little sections, mostly associated with areas where there's like a mountain bog or something like that. I imagine that they had like springs that they got their water and stuff from. But they're anywhere, it's kind of strange because anywhere you find a flat place on Pine Mountain, there's usually a homestead sometime or another that was associated with it years and years ago. And things, you know, so and those date back probably to the 1800s to the 19, even up to maybe the 1940s, you know, and stuff. It's a nice hemlock.
Yeah. Yeah, so that one, it's amazing to think of how many home sites there were on Pine Mountain, and also connecting that to what Dr. Ben was talking about on Wednesday about land ownership and shifting land use over time. And now this is a place that is, it's managed in a very different way and used in a very different way, where, you know, you can hike, but they may, you know, close the trails to manage the number of people who can come in and hike if it's gonna take away from the integrity of the forest or something. And so this is a very different way of being in, of human interaction in the forest. And so now I'm gonna play that clip about old growth forests, and then we can talk about these.
The big picture, if you think about this, okay? You look at an old growth forest, it's recycling and reusing and stuff over and over again. If you look at the big picture, you can't see it in a lifetime, but it's happening. The land is being plowed naturally over and over and over again. And as it's doing that, more nutrients go into the soil, you know, more fungi, things like that develop, you know, and as it does that, you know, it creates more habitat for, say, reptile, amphibians, you know, all different things. But mostly, this is the way I picture it, okay? It's because you'll see these big pit and mounds and things. It's completely big trees dying, fall or uprooting, and it's just completely plowed, just like it's being tilled over and over again. But it's not by some mechanical means. It's nature taking its course.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And I mean, it's a big thing. I mean, think about it as, you know, it's always recycling and reusing everything over and over again. It's at that stage that it can actually take care of itself.
Right. Right.
If left alone, and we can keep foreign exotics or whatever, you know, and things like that from interfering with the process.
Right.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, cool. So, did y'all learn anything or have any thoughts about oral history or and natural history, or did you have any thoughts about, like, oh, I would have asked a follow-up question here if I were Emma, or are there any thoughts that you came to your mind as you listened? kind of big questions. Here I am, I guess, just trying to convince convince everyone of oral history and how great it is. But I guess I'm curious about, oh, look, there is a chat. I'm curious about, you know, because I'm coming from a different perspective, the sometimes I benefit a lot from oral history interviews because of the kind of, they're kind of walking me through what can be really hard to understand. This sometimes the scientific literature can be kind of hard. So let's see what, oh good, got a couple of students who want to share. Go for it.
Karen was just mentioning the long history of human environment interactions in the Appalachian region, and just how oral history is a great opportunity to for them to residents to share from that long experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can really get at that long history. Cool.
Yeah, so Olivia was just sharing that in another class, she was learning about oral history in a very like social context. So it's cool to hear it applied in a natural sciences context.
Oh, cool. That's great. Yeah.
And we've got one more. Sorry.
Thanks for that comment.
Great. Yeah, so Josh was just sharing about how in Appalachia there's stories that are shared generation to generation. He was just talking about how that tradition of storytelling in Appalachia makes oral history particularly an important source of information about the natural world in that region.
Yes, and it's cool to listen to some of the folklore and the oral tradition that where trees and forests have pretty big roles in them. So yeah, thank you for that. That's very good. Cool.
The big picture, if you think about it.
Just click that again.
And that's where people settle
Sorry,
down.
sound issue. Okay, so returning to those questions, it sounds like based on y'all's comments along the way that there's definitely overlap between Appalachian environmental history and Appalachian natural history ways of interpreting and interacting with how people interpret and interact with the natural world. And I guess I'm sort of thinking of Appalachian environmental history as sort of like an umbrella term that can that's inclusive of natural history. But you know, if anyone has any other visuals or ideas about how they relate, let me know. And if anyone has any other thoughts on how other than oral history, if there's another method or way that the two fields can communicate more closely I'm all ears. And guess we can end on this quote that I'm curious how y'all feel about it. This is from an environmental historian in 1990, Donald Worcester. He said, "It may be that we moderns, after absorbing the lessons of today's science, find we cannot love nature quite so easily as Muir did, John Muir. But it may also be that we have discovered more reason than ever to respect it, to respect its baffling complexity, its inherent unpredictability, its daily turbulence, and to flap our own wings in it a little more gently." So that's that moral imperative coming up, that where humans acting in our own self-interest can do a lot of damage. And so it's our responsibility to check ourselves. But I was wondering what y'all think as you're learning, in class or learning more about science. Does it make you love nature more or less, or respect it more or less? Does it just curious? And I know we're coming to the end of the class, so sorry if we don't have time. Awesome.
Karen says that she both loves and respects it more.
Sweet. That's great. Nice. Yeah, as a historian, sometimes it does definitely makes me, I think, things are more complicated, but I do love learning about it. There's always so much more to learn. So thank y'all so much. Are there any questions? I really appreciate all the comments and participation from everybody. Sweet. More comments.
Yeah, so Hayden shared that last semester he had a class that required an hour of outdoor time every week. And it really helped him to appreciate the outdoors. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So Jordan just shared her appreciation of thinking about oral history kind of in the context of some readings that we've had more recently about Indigenous use of fire and land management historically, and kind of the knowledge that Indigenous peoples pass down through oral history in historical context. Is that curious? Yeah. And I'll just mention one other thing that I thought was really interesting, and that I was thinking about with respect to your question, the interactions between environmental history and natural history. I was really struck by the nuance of the oral histories you shared as far as their like place-basedness. Like they were really specific to Blanton Forest and really specific, to that particular spot. And you're able to draw like pretty significant meaning out of that into a broader context or a broader application. And so that was really interesting, that like opportunity for environmental history to provide really specific and nuanced information about a place and its history.
Yes.
And specific interactions, like there was a home right here, and you could think about that in a very specific kind of context.
Yep. That is one of the, I think, one of the beauty of oral history, and especially if you're doing a walking interview or something where you can, that's tied to place, time, season, or it gets to be very nuanced. Thank you.
Well, we are out of time. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Emma. And we'll give Emma a round of applause.
It was a
Hopefully
pleasure.
you'll
Thank
be
you all
able to-
so much.
Thank you.
I'll see y'all